listening to The Tenderness Revolution, a podcast about the stories of kindness, compassion, and empathy that play out in our lives, because these deeply moving experiences describe what it means to be human and invite us into a new way of thinking about the world and each other. I'm your host, writer and journalist Yvonne Gavin, and every episode I'll be asking a new interviewee about a pivotal moment of tenderness that helped shape the course of their life. Today's conversation is with author Natalie Toon Patton, whose memoir, Wanderlost, which is about her journey, an actual physical journey which begins in her childhood growing up in Arkansas in the deep south of America, in a fundamental Southern Baptist church, how she was the golden girl of her town, the prom queen, the virgin bride, and then a shunned divorcee, and became an outsider as she moved around the world from the Middle East to Europe and Asia. But it's also about a long and winding inward journey, spiritually and emotionally, and it really resonated with me as someone who's also living a loosely nomadic life and is about to move again from Africa to Asia this year. So it was one of those conversations that really highlighted this. I suppose it's a sort of a deep truth that our lives are not defined by what happens to us. They're defined by the way that we respond to events and ultimately the lens that we choose to see things through, as hard as this may seem. And one of the things that really struck me, actually, one of the things that I learned from Natalie was this yearning to feel at home in the world, to lean into curiosity, which is the doorway into seeing people and places fully. And her descriptions of the relationships that she formed in surprising circumstances, as well as this openness to discovery, to finding parts of herself in the places that she visited, will really inspire you, I hope, to see the world and other people differently. It really was a pleasure to sit down and talk to Natalie about all of these things, and I really hope that you enjoy this episode. So Natalie, thank you so much for being on the Tenderness Revolution today. I'm really looking forward.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And I wanted to start off by asking you, as I always do, to share your moment of tenderness with us. So the idea behind the Tenderness Revolution podcast is that essentially our lives are made up of all these little stories stitched together. And when we shine a light on scenes where we felt a profound sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves, moments where we felt seen or understood, or that we had a deeper relationship to the world around us, it's as though we're awakened to a greater sense of meaning and purpose. So please do share your moment with us.
Yes, thank you. I love this. I love this question, and I love listening to the people that you interview and their responses. And something I've noticed is that it seems like it's the moments that really catch us off guard. It's not the ones that you think are going to be the big moments. It's not the mountaintop moments. It's the ordinary times that kind of sneak up on us, that find us, like the thin moments, right? So for me, I was thinking about which story I would share, and there's one that I write about in my memoir of visiting Damascus, Syria. And it was on the very last day. I wasn't feeling up for visiting this particular mosque. We had a driver. He was more or less a chaperone there to keep us out of trouble, a professional briber who got us across the border, and he wanted to take us to the Umayyad Mosque. And so at that point, I had been living in the Middle East for a couple of years, and I had a little bit of mosque fatigue. I wasn't feeling it. But I went anyway, and I was with my cousin and my colleague and one of my best friends, and we were stretched out on the marble floor there, and we noticed a part of the mosque that had come to find out, it contained the head of John the Baptist, which completely blew my mind. Growing up Southern Baptist, you just don't make that connection that Islam also has the prophet Yahya, which is John the Baptist. And so they had this shrine there that contained the head of John the Baptist. And so we just laid out on these marble floors, and the call to prayer came on. And at this point, I had learned that this particular mosque was originally the temple of Baal in ancient times, and then it was the temple of Jupiter in Roman times, and then it was a synagogue, and then it was a Christian church, and then it was a mosque. And for 70 years, the same place was shared as a space of worship. For Muslims and Christians, they both used the same place. Wow. Which, in modern times, that we think, how is that even possible? And something about that moment and the call to prayer, I was still wrestling with my own faith at the time, and I just felt this undercurrent of mercy for all of the people that were ever in that exact place, for all of the ways that we plead the favor of God, given our imperfect theology. And I just felt mercy. I felt mercy for all of the people, all of the seekers, all of the people that had come there with prayers to different deities over the centuries, from ancient times to the present. I just felt mercy. I didn't have to have an answer for every theological question. There was just mercy there, and that was all. And so for me, the tenderness was about just the mercy that I felt for everyone.
Wow, that's such an incredible story. And whilst you were describing it, I could almost hear the call to prayer, because it's so distinctive. And something about sitting on the floor kind of connects you, I think, to a building, or you could almost feel the movements of other people and imagine other bodies having sat there, and the vibrations of people having walked there. And it's so interesting. It's as though you're describing the connectedness of people, or this sense of common humanity, that we're all connected and we're all seeking the same thing.
It was just sort of like a timeless moment, and there were children running around, there were little boys in the corner smoking cigarettes. It was just
and you can
the vibrance of
you can
humanity.
feel the vibrations of history. You could literally almost feel it in your body. That's just so profound, and I had no idea that buildings, it's almost like it was designated a holy building, and it had been repurposed.
Right.
So there was obviously a sense that this building really had, it felt like people would want to worship there. There was something about it, but it kept being repurposed. I mean, that's really quite incredible. I love that, and it's so really ties in with your your book, which is essentially about this kind of spiritual quest that you go on in your life, and there's this sense of curiosity, I think, that kind of underpins the book, and there's this sort of, in the beginning you talk about you tell this story where you say to your mum that you want to go to this Italian restaurant because you saw it featured in a popular TV show, and it was as though the food you'd got, you'd seen this food, you wanted to try it, but it was almost like it was a metaphor for something else. It was a metaphor for this curiosity in you, and this sense of wanting to taste something new, because you describe the foods of the food that you grow up with in the deep south, and it actually sounds really exotic to me as someone from the UK. It's this sort of, I can almost smell the barbecue and the chicken and the way you describe the gravy, and but that for you was familiarity, and you were looking for something different. And I just wondered, where did this kind of curiosity come from? Also, the way you describe nature, as though you feel the spiritual kind of essence of nature. You connect to that, and there's all these things in you from a young age that is just, it's there, it's within you. I remember you described the trees near your house as being like your guardians, and then I think you described the curiosity as being equal parts live culture and magnetic force, which I love that description. So where did it all come from? Is there any way that you can...
Yeah, well, I talk about my own wanderlust woes from an early age, just that pull to be somewhere else, to experience life in another culture, in another place, and it's just the big what else is out there feeling. I think we all have that curiosity as children, and we just forget. It just gets stomped out of us. Which is why I was just talking with a friend about this yesterday, how she still lives in my hometown, and she mentioned, I drove by Gayla's costume shop yesterday, and I mentioned this particular costume shop that I had to get this Dolly Parton outfit from, and I was just thinking, I'm so jealous. I wish I could just go back to Saline County for one day. And we were talking about, it's like, that's why the places that we grew up in, we remember, we knew that they were sacred. We knew that everything was sacred as a child. And then we just forget. As we get older and we get burdened with the stuff of life, we lose that itch and that sense of wonder and curiosity. And so I think it's within all of us as children, and it's within all of us to rediscover as we age.
It's like it gets covered over with all these kind of layers, and it's like there are these kind of weights and these heavy feelings and experiences that we kind of take on, and they kind of build up, but what's actually underneath is our true nature, which is this natural curiosity and lightness and love, and that sort of makes me think of your childhood growing up in the Southern Baptist Church. And it's so interesting how what you were taught in that church, or the words that you were kind of handed through that experience, are so opposite to what you're describing. And when you actually, the way you put it in the book, it really had an effect on me, the way you describe how it made you feel as a child. And I actually went for a walk because I had to really process what it must have felt like for you. So what I'm talking about is when you describe how, you were taught that what's deepest within you is dark and sinful, and that although God loves you more than you can imagine, if you don't accept Christ in the right way, he'll make sure that you burn in hell. I mean, it's just so confusing. It's like, how can those things, go together? Like, how it's contradictory, it's heavy, it's sad, it's such a lot to kind of put on a young child. And I grew up in Catholic faith, so I know about some of these dark shadows in the Christian church, but there's just so much emphasis, isn't there, on fear and power, and consequences. And I sort of wonder about two things. Firstly, I wanted to ask you, these churches, they sit within the Christian tradition, and although there's so much wisdom embedded in that tradition, there's also like shadow and dark. And I just wonder, is that a really good thing? How could you perhaps change all of that, or is there a way to change all of that? As in, I think if you take the tradition and even the Southern Baptist Church as it is today, but you question it, there needs to be some vigorous sort of open-ended discussion and questioning, and that's how you bring about change. And it seems as though there's resistance to that. Like, how do you think it's possible for that, to happen?
Oh, I'm trying to consider how optimistic I'm going to be with my answer. From my experience, there is no room for doubt and questioning it's a closed system, and it makes people uncomfortable to even talk about it. I mean, the moment that I've showed my cards, before I wrote the book, before any of this, the moment that I showed my cards to some people that were close to me, I think I might have been put on some prayer lists.
As in, you were questioning. That
Right.
was the beginning where
Right.
you were actually voicing those questions,
Right.
saying things out loud that you'd always thought.
Right. And it's not that I have thrown out everything that I was taught. I still do have some good memories of church as a child, as strange as that sounds from the things that I criticize. It is the faith that nurtured me early on. And so in a way, I wouldn't have the faith that I have now had I not had that as a child. But I came to a point where they say you have to vote with your feet. If you can't, I mean, the Southern Baptist Church, for example, it's probably the largest, most powerful denomination in America. It has a tremendous amount of political power. And yet women are still oppressed and not allowed to lead. It's anti-gay. It's, there are these things that to me are just so big, and that I can't take them on my own. And so the best way is to just leave and go to another church or denomination that doesn't have theology that's violent. I see it as violent theology.
Yes.
And I've seen the harm, I've seen the data, and it's not just me. I mean, there's a whole deconstruction movement that's kind of become kind of a dirty word in a lot of circles. Deconstruction, like it's this big bad thing, when really for a lot of people it started with just identifying harm that they saw or being harmed themselves from these types of churches and these types of closed systems. So,
but that's where the danger lies. I mean, that really is dangerous territory, not being allowed to question. That's just like huge alarm bells. Not being allowed to question anything, I think, is dangerous territory.
Right.
Not being allowed to interrogate, not being allowed to challenge. That's the basis from which like all healthy kind of belief systems and sort of any kind of system or
Right.
structure comes. So
and
the
we
fact
know
that
this
that's
as mothers, right? Like we
Yes.
know from dealing with our children. Imagine if we never allowed them to ask questions. We would squash any curiosity that they had. But we know from our mother's heart that we want to give our children the freedom and the liberty to question, to ask all the questions, to search for themselves. We have to give them that out of love. And so I've come to see God as being like that. It's God can handle our big questions. He can handle our doubt.
I mean, what you're describing there it's so interesting, because this thing of not being allowed to question, that I think is where you have these kind of heaviness that starts to cover up the curiosity when you're not allowed to question, and then things start to harden, and that's when it's like you lose touch with your true self, that real core sense of who you are. And I know you describe how it was almost as though, and I think it's fantastic, you're very aware, very self-aware of this like pleasing behavior that you were taught, to be an A student, the virgin bride, the prom queen. And, it's as though there's these kind of masks and these kind of, we adopt these ways of being because we understand that that's the only way that we can be accepted. Questioning, challenging is not accepted. But I wanted to ask you then, in relation to that, about your children. How do you talk to them about spirituality? Because this is something I'm really fascinated by. I was brought up Catholic, and my children don't go to church. And I hear them say things like, in our family, we don't believe in God, or we don't have a religion. And I'm sometimes struck by, oh gosh, like, yeah, I just kind of forgot about that because there's no church here that I feel a part of. How does that work for you? How do you teach your children about spirituality?
Sure. This is an ongoing ongoing project, because my husband and I are really careful we don't want to project our own spiritual trauma and baggage onto our kids because their spiritual journey is their spiritual journey. So we want to keep alive some traditions that we find valuable. We still do celebrate Advent. We read from the Celtic Daily Prayer Book during Advent. And Christmas, we still pray together over dinner at night. I still read them Bible stories from the late Reverend Desmond Tutu has a good Children of God storybook Bible, and the way that he tells the stories, the stories from the Bible, it's always with the underlying message that all humans are children of God. And so that's the difference from what the faith that I was given. Whereas children of God are only those that have said a certain prayer, rather than all of humanity is children of God.
Rather than just those who believe.
Right. Only the people in this little club,
in this
and
little
then
club.
everybody else, like, be damned.
Yeah.
So they still have that foundation, but they also have, they have deep spiritual questions. I have one who was crying a few nights ago because she was overwhelmed by the concept of heaven and, what's that supposed to be like? And then for another child, he's decided that, heaven just sounds kind of boring. Why would Jesus just farm me out to another planet? That the whole idea of being stuck in one place, even the kids know that, some of these concepts are
almost too simple. It's almost like they're too simple for children to, like, don't give me that. That doesn't make sense.
Right. You can't pull one over on these kids, right? This generation they are not here for the easy answers. So I've just kind of let them and give them the freedom to try on different theological hats. We lived in Thailand for a season, so they know about reincarnation, and they some of them have expressed things about it that they agree with or think that, maybe it's like this. It's
that thing of encouraging the questioning and the wondering and the curiosity, that maybe.
Well, and separating, always letting them know this is what our tradition teaches us, but there's these other traditions that might see it differently. And nobody really knows. And what matters is love. God is love. And that's all you have to know right now. God is love.
Definitely. That thing of being very open about, we don't really know. So I wonder, and it's okay to not know. And also, that thing of tradition. And there's always this kind of tension. I find it too, like I was saying before, tradition, there's something in tradition that's very important and it's very grounding. But also it's important to have that questioning and that renewal with tradition. Otherwise,
kind of like you have to learn the rules before you can break the rules. You have to have some kind of structure and foundation, and then.
But you have to have the questioning. Otherwise, it becomes, there's a sinister element to it, and it can become dangerous territory.
Legalistic.
So that's so interesting. Thanks for giving me some ideas, actually.
I'm still learning. We're still figuring this out.
Oh, it's definitely an ongoing journey. Definitely for us as well. With your father's death, I found it really moving, the way that you wrote about that in the book. Particularly when you described how you and your sister drove him up to see the yellow blossoms on the mountain. And I wanted to ask you about thin places. So thin places are known as spaces where the distance between heaven and earth collapses, because it almost feels like you're saying that in the book, it felt like you were saying that acceptance, or like a seeing things as they really are, is like a doorway into thin places. And when you quote Julian of Norwich, who I've come across before, writes so beautifully about Christianity, all will be well, which is like the opposite of the message of fear that you were continually given in the church. And also the Paul McCartney song Let It Be, there's this sense that surrender is like the key. Is that what you meant?
I think so. I mean, for me, I mentioned the death of my father. He was in his late 40s, and he was an alcoholic. And I just, in my head at the time, in my simplistic faith, I just knew that he would see the light, and if I could only pray hard enough, if I only have enough faith, then he's going to be healed. It's this transactional nature. Oh, God will bless me. God will answer my prayer if I just pray hard enough. But it didn't happen that way. He only got sicker. He asked us to take him to see the yellow daffodils, and he kind of fell into a trance. I mentioned the song Let It Be. It was like Mother Mary was, or Mother God, however you look at it. And now that I'm a mother, I see it this way. I can't speak to how death felt like to him, but it appeared as though he had a supernatural peace, and that he was able to see everything. He was able to see the thin places, as I mentioned, the Daffodil Mountain. The thin places are already there. It's just, do we have eyes to see them? And so his death, nothing about that circumstance was how I imagined it would play out. But yet there was so much mercy, and that feeling that I got, and in the aftermath of that, I had a dream, that sort of a mystical experience surrounding his death. It was sort of the same feeling that I got in the mosque that day in Syria, that how I imagine things are and then how they actually are two different things. And that any place can be a thin place, any moment can be a thin moment. It's just adjusting our eyes and heart to see it for what it is.
Yeah, oh gosh, that makes me think of, I was listening to, I don't know if you've heard of John O'Donoghue. I listened to a fantastic interview with him. I'll share it with you. And before he died, and he was talking about that very thing. He actually said that everyone is an artist because they create their experience of life. So everyone is creating all the time, and every single human's experience is different because of how they see the world and how they create the world. And it's like there's always this, and I know exactly what you're talking about. It's like there's always, it's there, like if you can actually really see it and surrender to it, the truth and the beauty is there. But it's like we're so often caught up in busy lives and stress and worry and rushing, and that we can't see it, or we're caught up with those heavy things. And yeah, I think what's really beautiful about your father's death, and I've found this in other descriptions of death as well, is there's this sense that the person who's dying, they move into that awareness, that suddenly they see things as they are, and they just let go, and they're surrendering. And yeah, I really got that from your description too. Did your father's death really impact on your relationship with spirituality and religion? Was it like a turning point for you?
Yeah, I think it was. It made more sense when I became a mother, and I thought, isn't it just like a mother to snatch the kid up in her arms that can't get it together? And sometimes we dole out more compassion for the kid that's having issues. And I feel like my dad felt that on his deathbed. He felt love and compassion and mercy. And that was all that was left, and that was it. And so at that time, in my faith journey, I still had so much fear and shame from the theology that I was handed. And that was sort of the beginning of chipping away of maybe God is not how I think he is or she is. Maybe I'm wrong about some things. It was probably the first moment, when I prayed so hard for something and I didn't get it. But yet the mercy that was there and what I witnessed and what our family witnessed, it definitely opened the door to see God in a different light. And over the years, I'm just reading the way that the mystics write about God. There's so many parallels between the Christian mystics and the Muslim mystics and the Buddhist mystics, and they all say something like, our holy books say that God is like this, God is full of wrath, but we know God is like this. It's sort of like they get a taste of the love and mercy of God, and they know that it's different than what some of their holy books say. And so for me, the actual experience was different than what I was taught to believe, or a way of interpreting scripture that I just don't believe to be true anymore.
And I suppose that's the ultimate thing. It's this thing of interpretation. I mean, the Bible is an ancient book of stories, but there have been so many ancient texts, and really the key is how you read it.
Right.
It has so many layers to it. And I think that, again, the dangerous thing, I think, that you experienced in the Baptist church is this sense, well, there's only this interpretation. We will only read it in this particular way.
Right.
And I'm the funnel through which, the truth comes. Whereas the book is there. I mean, the stories are rich and multi-layered and so much, profound beauty and love and truth in them. But when they're read in a particular way, they can be spun.
It sucks the life and joy out of it to read it as legalistically, every word in here is from the hand of God, rather than seeing it as a library, seeing it as literature that is inspired. I mean, for me, there's joy again. I mean, I can actually read the Bible again now and not feel triggered, because for a long time I just felt triggered by the way that certain verses were interpreted, and now being able to hold it lightly and just see the poetry for what it is and see the literature for what it is, and not take every single word literally. And I think most people, whether they admit it or not, it's the things that we take literally that matters, right? Like some of the same people that won't literally think that Jesus means love your enemies or sell your possessions and give them to the poor. They won't take those parts literally, but yet they'll use certain verses to beat people over the head as a means of control and violence. And, we can look at history and see that the Bible has been used to justify countless atrocities on this continent that we're on right now in particular. I've been doing some research about that. And the Bible has been used as a weapon rather than a sacred collection, a sacred library with that points to love and points to mercy. And so that's how I read scripture now, and that's how we treat it with our, in our family and talking about it with our kids.
I'm really interested in the way you refer to mercy. What do you mean by mercy? I'd like to know what you mean by that.
The way that I see mercy is just sort of it's the undercurrent of it is the life force that's under everything. And maybe you refer to it as tenderness. That's a really good question. I just wrote a whole book on mercy. I'm trying to come up with a decent answer here. For me, it's being surprised by the way you thought something was, and then it turns out to be something else. To me, that's mercy. That's
like
mercy.
It's a deep truth.
That everything is okay. Like the Julian of Norwich quote that you mentioned,
Everything
all
is
shall be
okay.
well, and every manner of things shall be well.
Yeah.
It's all okay.
Yeah.
It's all mercy.
Yeah.
I mean, we're our biggest critics, are we not? We go through our day, we wake up in the middle of the night, we're thinking about that thing that we forgot, or that person we forgot to email back,
So
or
true.
just all the things that pile on.
But it just always comes back to that thing of, I must be a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, if you can keep going back to that other wisdom, which is like, underneath it all, I'm good. Like, I'm really deeply, as we all are in our core, as babies, just pure goodness. That's the truth of who we are. But it gets covered over. And yeah, self-compassion, I think, is like something else I'm really interested in. And it's so hard. Like, why is it so unnatural for us to say, it's okay.
Yeah.
Everything is okay and all will be well. That feels like alien. It
does.
definitely did.
It does. Especially if you're brought up in a religion that tells you that what is at your core is evil and not good, and that tells you that you can't trust your own voice, you can't trust your own intuition. It becomes confusing. I think for some of your listeners, they may think, oh, well, isn't that obvious? But for a lot of us, it's not obvious.
No.
We're traumatized by this idea that we are inherently bad and that God can't look at us because of our sin. And I was always told this line, God can't look at you because of your sin. And I'm thinking, well, if God is everywhere and within everything, like, how can God separate
It's
God
so confusing.
It's confusing, right?
Oh.
But if the starting place is you are inherently good, God's creation is good. God made creation and called it good. The very first chapter of the Bible. If that's where we start, then it changes everything. It changes how we see ourselves. It changes how we see other people. It changes how countries treat one another. It changes
Massively.
everything.
Everything.
That one thing changes everything.
Yeah. So ultimately you've got fear and then you've got love. So like, love is the truth that's at the heart of these stories, these ancient stories in the Bible. And then fear is kind of what was put on top of all of it, or it's kind of wrapped around all of it. And it's like this funnel through, I don't know why, some sense of wanting to control. But you have these two polarities and they're opposite. But coming from that place of love is, that it brings ease and lightness and trust. And then you can live, I suppose, fully, and you can have this sense of surrender, connection. It sounds as though definitely that you found that through your travelling around the world. I wanted to ask about when you moved to Istanbul and you're training for a new job. You find yourself at Hagia Sophia, and you watch a Muslim man praying. Can you talk about what did you feel that day?
It was the first time that I saw someone in another faith pray. And so I wanted to know, God, do you hear his prayers? Do you hear his prayers? He's not a Christian, but do you, it's funny saying it now. Again, it could be obvious for some people. Of course God hears his prayers. But for me at the time, I wanted to know. I wanted to know. It was an open door that chipped away at my notion of how we interact with God. And then later on that day, I sort of got lost in the bazaar. And that was sort of the beginning of, it's okay to wander just for the sake of wandering. We don't have to know where this is going. We don't have to have all the answers.
So it's okay to enjoy life. Like, it's okay to just think, this is interesting, just because it's interesting, without feeling bad somehow.
Right. Even pleasure. I think we're sort of taught that like pleasure is bad and we should deny ourselves pleasure rather than just enjoying pleasure for the sake of pleasure. Yeah. Even that's holy. That's good. Pleasure.
Yeah. One of the things that you repeatedly cover is your journey through this earth, your journey with God, with your faith, and it's something that so many of us struggle with, sort of constantly trying to seek answers. What do you think was so unique about this combination of travelling and your connection with God?
Yeah, that's a good question. Finding God in all the places where God wasn't supposed to be. That was huge for me. Experiencing profound love and hospitality in Damascus, Syria, that was supposed to be our enemy of the United States, and just that subversive nature of being loved and cared for by people that are in another tribe, religiously, culturally. That really turned things upside down for me, because I was taught early on that about the fruits of the Spirit, and only Christians have these things. And then when you see other people that are crushing it, that makes you uncomfortable, right? There's this cognitive dissonance that happens, and that's what I experienced in a lot of places, and just seeing so much light and love in places that were so foreign to me. That kind of put me on the fast track of deconstructing everything. And
it sounds like you're unraveling the stories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you've been handed these narratives about this is the truth about the way things are, and this is the truth about who we are and who they are, the other. And there's, good and there's bad. And then you start to realise that actually it's much more complex than that.
Right. And seeing the similarities, too, between our cultures. I mentioned Gulf Arabs, for example. They reminded me so much culturally of people back home. And like the hospitality and the drive-through liquor stores, not wanting to be recognized, the warmth. I mean, the best parts of the culture that I came from, in some ways, I could see that in this other group. And I knew that these two groups of people were distrusting of each other, and that would imagine they didn't have anything in common, but yet I saw so many similarities.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're talking about, I've mentioned it already, but this Buddhist notion of common humanity. So, as in, we're all one, we're all connected. And in Jordan, there's a part in the book where you say, I saw the light of humanity as beautiful and multifaceted, dancing and refracting in all directions, as every colour we see is a different wavelength of light reflected back to our eyes. So the different colours of our lights make up pieces of the one light born out of love. So is that what you are referring to?
Absolutely. Thanks for reading that. I'm like, wow, did I write that? I don't remember that quote. That's precisely how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as though, I don't know, I wonder if there's anything as effective as travelling to really kind of reveal these truths. That people are people, that people have the same aspirations, actually. I did hear recently there was a study that, amazingly, across all the continents and all the different, people's levels of wealth, and everyone ultimately has the same aspirations for their children, and we all have the same struggles and traveling and meeting people is like it's I don't know, I think it's probably the best way of really understanding that truth for yourself.
I think so. There's nothing better than, for a young person. We were just talking about, before we started this interview, your experience teaching English in Japan, and I hope that our children have an opportunity to travel before they settle down. And I know for a lot of people, they don't have that privilege, or maybe their passport doesn't get them in all the places where we got to go. So there's that element. But even going to a different side of town or a different state, or taking the time to wander somewhere else. This was one of the things I did early on in the pandemic. When we couldn't travel, I would just go to these little towns in Virginia alone sometimes and just wander through old graveyards or streets that didn't belong to me, new places that I just needed to have that time to wander and sort of like let the thin places find you rather than seeking them out. I think that does a lot of good for people's soul and spirit when they're stuck in a rut, or maybe they have an awareness, they want to be more open, more accepting, more loving, but they don't have the means to fly to the other side of the world. And there are other ways too, rather than just jet setting everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't necessarily have to. It's more about a way of seeing. What you're talking about is a way of fully seeing things. It could just be, people who are living in the next town, but to actually fully see people is something I think that we often struggle with. So many of us struggle with. To fully imagine someone else's feelings, someone else's life, someone else's experience, and sometimes it's easier to do that when you're traveling and it's so different. Sometimes it's harder when it's someone who's similar to you,
right?
But the opportunity, like you said, it's always there. It's important to remember that, I think. In the book, when you go to Jerusalem, that was really interesting. So, obviously Jerusalem is, the hub of all things faith, and you describe having big expectations to encounter the Spirit of God in the footsteps of Jesus. But instead, you find yourself exhausted, claustrophobic, underwhelmed. And I think it's that thing again of like, where do we find God? Like, why does God have to be found in these designated holy places? Again, when I was listening to John O'Donoghue, he was talking about how God is beauty, and I thought that was such a interesting way of putting it, or such an interesting concept. God is beauty within people, in nature, in the landscape, everywhere. And the root of the word beauty is actually calling, which I thought was really fascinating. So that kind of ties into this sense of wandering or feeling compelled to see something, to look for something. I don't know if you could say just something a bit about that, about these, these holy places that you went to.
Yes.
And how, sometimes you had experiences that were very profound and sometimes you didn't.
I think it's important to distinguish, for me, the difference between a pilgrimage and a peregrination. So I went to Jerusalem sort of on a pilgrimage. I'm going to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Jesus's crucifixion and burial. But it became claustrophobic, and I didn't feel anything at all, and it was disappointing and underwhelming. And I think a lot of people that go on pilgrimages, that's sort of what they experience, because the stakes are so high and they have all these expectations for how it's supposed to feel, and it rarely delivers. Whereas a peregrination, you've mentioned John O'Donohue, and I'm a big fan of his work as well. There's this concept in Celtic spirituality of peregrination, where you are in search of the place of your own resurrection, usually a journey. And so the difference is that you're going out with no expectations. Maybe you're moving to a new place, maybe you're moving to a new town, maybe you're on a vacation, maybe you've just completely ran away. That's a true peregrination, is when it's a one-way ticket, you're not coming back. And I think it's in those moments that we have our greatest growth spiritually, when the thin places sort of find us.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by that term that you used in the book, peregrination, and so it's linked to the peregrine falcon. And I love that you've decided that's what your journey was, and how it's distinct and it's different in that way. But this sense of it, you said it was to do with your resurrection, or it was the place where you find a resurrection. Is that how you would describe the journey in the book, as though you came back to the true sense of who you are?
I think so. I mean, when I initially ran away from home, it was an escape from a divorce and a shaming. I was kicked out of church in a small town, and just that paralyzing sense of shame. It's hard to go to the grocery store and run into certain people. It's, there's just that constant dark cloud. And so for me, it had to be a geographical change. I had to leave the place that I loved so much and that was home for me. I had to go somewhere else. And so the place of my resurrection was many places. It was, it was a journey around the world, but coming home to myself at the same time, and coming home to this truth that I am good. I am innately good. And that there's nothing I have to do to prove myself anymore.
There's nothing you have to do, yeah.
It just is. We all are.
We all are, yeah. And I think early on in the book you mentioned something about there are pieces of yourself all over. Scattered. And I love that idea that you were already somehow there. And then you went and you found that part of you, or you reconnected. So the resurrection was almost like in the rediscovering, or that coming back to that truth. Yeah, it's really, really beautiful. And when you were in Thailand, you describe how you struggled to find your footing, the right church, this place of belonging. What was the most surprising lesson that you learned there in Thailand? What did you...
I guess the most surprising thing, I had a relationship with a group of Somali refugees that really was sort of the last turning my world upside down. I think at that point in my faith journey, I really tried to double down on some things, and I've seen this pattern before. When people are about to have a breakthrough, they right before they try to double down and stick with what they think they know, and then there's just sort of this letting go, and then things resolve. And so for me, that was the experience I had. I initially thought, I can be a good influence. If I'm really honest here, I can help these refugees, and I can, there's this sense of pride of what you're capable of doing. And then in the end, they sort of turned my world upside down.
They taught you.
They taught me. It's I'm not converting them. They're converting me. So my relationship with them and really the love and care that I received from them, I think to be cared for and nurtured by someone in a marginalized community. It's the most subversive thing ever. I mean, we think that, it's our job to help them, but to receive their love in return and their friendship and preserve that dignity that's there and that light that's burning in all of us. As you mentioned before, we all want the same things. We're all figuring stuff out. And so definitely my relationship with the Somali refugee community changed the way that I saw God. And still does. I still think about it from time to time and think about the faith that they have and the love and compassion and tenacity and the best things of the human spirit, and they embody all of it. People that have been through absolute hell and still have that spirit with them. I have no words left.
That's so beautiful, thank you. Your book is, as I mentioned at the beginning, has this strong current of curiosity running through it. Mm-hmm. But there's so many other things in it too. And there's this question I always ask at the end of the interview, because the idea behind the Tenderness Revolution is that having this quality of tenderness for ourselves and others, or mercy, is embodied in the 3 C's. So it's embodied in them because they enable us to fully see the truth about the way things are. And they are courage, curiosity, and compassion. So I wanted to ask you, if you had to choose one of these qualities that means the most in your life, which would you choose and why?
Good question. I'm going to say curiosity. I would like to pretend to be more compassionate, but I still have some work in that department. Curiosity, the whole experience of writing this book, for example, was and just learning how the creative process works. And everybody listening right now, I can imagine that there is some kind of itch that's pulling them in a direction. And I think this is spirit. I think we are co-creators with the master creator of the universe. And this spirit pulls all of us to create things, to make things, to try new things, to learn new things. And it is always scary, and there's always risk. Whatever it is, we make up excuses. I can't do that. I don't want to do that. But it persists, and it's there. And so having just gone through this experience of writing this book, and now there's another creative itch that's pulling me in a different direction, but we all have those. And I think we develop muscle memory over time of how to listen to them and how to nurture it and see it as a friend rather than this deep, dark, scary thing that might make us go off the deep end, right? What are people going to think? How am I going to pull this off? And I think that the spirit that's behind that causes us to create things, that is the love and mercy and tenderness that really makes the world go round, that causes healing, or to use a biblical word, shalom. If we are all listening to that curious itch that's pulling us in a certain direction, then imagine how the world could be. Need to preach that to myself. Sermon for today.
That's a good one. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank
really
you.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Tenderness Revolution. I hope you come back for more, because my aim with this podcast is to help us become more aware of these moments of kindness and compassion and how they shape our lives, and enable us to feel more connected to the world around us.